Samuel Winters stood inside his barn on a January morning in 1844, watching through the wide opening as his neighbor Robert Fletcher struggled to chip frozen snow off his woodpile 30 yards away. The winter sun hung pale and distant in a colorless swan. Robert's two children stood beside him, small figures bundled in layers of wool, their breath rising in clouds that vanished into the bitter air. Samuel turned. 3 steps took him to his protected firewood stack. The logs were dry to the touch, smooth under his calloused fingers. He selected a piece of split oak, feeling its lightness the way perfectly seasoned wood should feel. The cabin door was just behind him. He walked back inside without needing to button his coat, without feeling the wind that made Robert's children huddle closer to their father. They called him mad when he started building. They said grief had broken his mind. They watched him dig foundation holes alone and shook their heads at the widower, who thought he could do the work of 3 men. But Samuel Winters had made a promise the day he buried his wife. Wet firewood had killed Emma. He would make certain it never killed anyone else. The barn surrounded him like a second sky, its massive timbers rising 12 feet overhead. Inside this protective shell at his cabin, solid and square smoke rising from its stone chimney. Between the cabin walls and the barn walls, firewood was stacked in careful rows. 12 cords of split wood, enough to burn day and night through the longest winter, and every piece was dry. 18 months earlier, Samuel had owned none of this. 18 months earlier, he had been a different man. The coughing started on January 8, 1842. Samuel woke in darkness to the sound of Emma struggling to breathe beside him. He reached for her in the black interior of their small cabin. Her body was shaking. When he lit a candle with trembling hands, he saw her face gray in the flickering light. Her chest heaved with the effort of pulling air into her lungs. The fire in their stone hearth had died to embers during the night. The cabin was cold enough that Samuel could see his own breath. He threw back the wool blankets and hurried to the woodpile they kept stacked against the interior wall near the door. His hands closed around 2 split logs. They felt heavy, wrong. He carried them to the hearth anyway and arranged them over the glowing embers, then stepped back and waited for them to catch. The logs smoldered. Smoke poured from them, instead of flame filling the small cabin with thick gray clouds that hung in the air. Emma coughed harder. Samuel opened the door. January wind howled into the cabin, driving the temperature even lower. He closed the door and tried again with the fire. He added kindling. He knelt and blew on the embers until his lungs ached. The wet wood refused to burn cleanly. It made smoke. It made almost no heat. By afternoon, Emma was delirious with fever. Samuel had managed to coax a weak fire from the damp wood, but the effort had consumed hours and wasted most of their dry kindling. The cabin was marginally warmer. Smoke still hung in the air despite his attempts to manage the draft. Emma's breathing came in shallow gasps. Her fever climbed. Samuel knew what was happening. He had seen it before in other frontier families. Wet firewood created smoke instead of heat. Smoke in enclosed spaces caused lung sickness. Lung sickness in winter without proper heat and clean air killed people. The chain of causation was simple. It was brutal. He went outside to their main woodpile. They had prepared it in autumn, a stack of split logs covered with canvas. The canvas had blown free during a December storm. Snow had buried the pile. Samuel dug through frozen snow with his bare hands until they went numb. He pulled out logs covered in ice and carried them inside. He tried to dry them near the weak fire. Ice melted into water. Water soaked into the wood. When he tried to burn it, the wood produced more smoke. For 3 days, Samuel fought to keep the fire going with wet wood. He barely slept. He burned a chair when the wood proved unusable. He wrapped Emma in every blanket they owned. Her skin felt like paper. Her eyes saw things that were not there. She spoke to people long dead, her voice rasping through damaged lungs. On January 11th, her breathing stopped. Samuel sat beside her body in the cold cabin. Outside, snow fell in silence. Inside, the weak fire crackled and sent up its thin column of smoke. He understood with perfect clarity that dry firewood would have saved her life. A proper fire would have kept the cabin warm. Clean burning wood would have prevented the smoke that destroyed her lungs. If their firewood had stayed dry through the winter, Emma would still be breathing. The knowledge settled into his mind like a stone dropping into still water. His wife had died because their firewood got wet. The solution was obvious. The wood needed to stay dry. Everything else was secondary. Samuel buried Emma on a hillside overlooking their claim on March 2nd. The ground had thawed enough to dig. He marked the grave with stones he carried up from the creek bed, choosing each one for its shape and weight. He spent that evening alone in the cabin, unable to sleep. The fire burned cleanly now. Spring wood dried quickly in the wind. The warmth came too late. He began his calculations the next morning. Samuel walked to the woodpile and counted. He estimated how many dry logs would have been needed to keep the cabin warm through January. He factored in fuel consumption per day. He thought about the wettest periods when even covered outdoor storage would fail. The mathematics were simple. 12 cords of completely dry firewood, accessible without exposure to weather, would guarantee survival through any winter. 12 cords required significant storage space. A standard woodshed would work if built large enough. But Samuel had watched woodsheds fail. Wind drove rain through gaps in the siding, snow drifted against walls and seeped inside. Roofs leaked at the seams. Even covered wood grew damp over months of winter weather. He needed something better than a shed. He needed wood stored as protected as if it were inside a building. The idea arrived fully formed one afternoon in late March. Samuel was repairing the cabin's exterior when he noticed how the logs themselves stayed dry under the roof overhang, but grew wet just inches away where rain could reach them. Protection from above mattered, but complete enclosure mattered more. Wood stored inside a building would stay perfectly dry. Wood stored inside a building would be accessible regardless of weather outside. He needed to store 12 cords of firewood inside a structure large enough to hold it. Most settlers would build a large shed or add a wood room onto their cabin. Samuel considered both options and rejected them. Additions leaked where new construction met old. Large sheds were difficult to build alone, and he would be working alone. He needed something simple enough for one man to construct, but large enough to solve the storage problem completely. A barn could hold 12 cords easily. A barn built with proper dimensions could house the firewood and provide covered workspace. But Samuel pushed the concept further. If the barn held firewood and the barn provided weather protection, why build the cabin separately? Why not build the cabin inside the barn? The idea seemed absurd at first consideration. Houses belong separate from barns. But Samuel worked through the logic methodically. A cabin built inside a barn would be protected from direct weather. The barn roof would shed rain and snow. The barn walls would block wind. The space between barn and cabin could store firewood with absolute weather protection. He could access his fuel supply without stepping outside. The cabin would benefit from the insulation effect of the surrounding barn structure. By May, Samuel had made his decision. He would build a barn first. Then he would build his cabin inside it. The firewood would be stored in the space between. Neighbors would think he was insane. That did not matter. Dry firewood would have saved Emma. He would never face wet firewood again. Samuel walked into Millbrook's general store on May 14th and asked Henry Brooks for barn building supplies. He needed timber hardware nails in quantity. Henry looked at the young widower with confusion in his eyes. "You live alone now," Henry said. "What do you need with barn materials?" Samuel explained his plan. He would build a barn structure approximately 30 feet by 20 feet. After completing the barn, he would construct a cabin inside it. The space between the barn walls and cabin would store his firewood supply. Henry listened without interrupting. When Samuel finished, the older man set down the ledger he had been holding. "Do you understand what you are proposing? A barn that size would take 3 men most of a summer to build. You are one man. You have no experience with timber framing. The cost of materials alone will consume most of what Emma left you. And at the end of all that effort, you will have a cabin inside a barn, which makes no practical sense when you could simply build a cabin in a woodshed for half the cost and labor." Samuel asked again about the materials. Henry sold him what he requested, but he mentioned the conversation to his wife that evening. Margaret Brooks mentioned it to neighbors. By the end of May, everyone in Millbrook knew that Samuel Winters planned to build a barn around a house. The reaction was consistent. Grief had broken his mind. Robert Fletcher visited Samuel in early June. Robert was a practical man of 52 years who had survived 15 winters on the frontier. He was a widower himself, raising 2 young children alone. He sat at Samuel's table and spoke carefully. "I understand you are lonely. I understand the winter was hard. But this barn plan is madness born from sorrow. You should build a proper cabin, or move back east to family. Building alone is dangerous. Building a barn before a house is backwards. Building a house inside a barn is the thinking of a man not in his right mind. Samuel thanked him for his concern and continued his preparations. He had already laid out the barn's foundation line using stakes and string. He had purchased timber from the sawmill and hauled it to his property over multiple trips. He had studied barn construction by visiting 3 farms and asking questions about post and beam framing. Robert left frustrated. He told others that Samuel would not listen to reason. The consensus in Millbrook became that someone should intervene. But frontier culture respected property rights and individual choice. If Samuel Winters wanted to waste his resources on a barn that housed a cabin, that was his decision. They would watch him fail. Then they would help him build something sensible afterward. The first real resistance came from an unexpected direction. Jack Morrison arrived on a morning in mid-June. He was a carpenter of 32 years, known throughout the region as the finest builder for 50 miles. He carried rolled paper under one arm. His clothes were clean. His boots were good leather. He had the confidence of a man who knew his own worth. Samuel was marking foundation holes with stakes when Jack dismounted from his horse. The carpenter approached and unrolled the papers. They showed detailed plans for a proper barn design. "I hear you plan to build a barn alone," Jack said. His voice carried the authority of a master tradesman. "This is work for professionals, not amateurs. You will fail. And when you do, you will make every carpenter in this region look incompetent by association." Samuel straightened from his work. He was 5 inches shorter than Jack Morrison and 40 pounds lighter. He wiped dirt from his hands and met the other man's eyes. "I am building what I need," he said quietly. "What you need is to hire a proper crew." Jack tapped the plans he held. "I can have this barn built in 6 weeks with 3 good men. Professional work. Square and solid. You hire me and I will build you something that will stand 50 years. Samuel looked at the plans. They were good plans, detailed and precise, but they showed a conventional barn, nothing more. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I will build it myself." Jack Morrison's face darkened. "You are making a mistake. A barn is not a cabin. It requires expertise you do not have. When your amateur construction collapses, do not come asking me to fix the mess." "I will not fail," Samuel said. Jack rolled up his plans. His jaw was tight. "We will see. When winter comes and your structure fails, everyone will know that amateurs cannot do the work of masters." He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Samuel watched him go, then returned to his stakes and string. He understood what had just happened. Jack Morrison saw him as a threat. An amateur succeeding where professionals claimed only they could work would damage reputations, would raise questions about whether expensive crews were truly necessary. Samuel had no interest in damaging anyone's reputation, but he would not hire Jack Morrison. He would not hire anyone. This barn would be built by his own hands, or it would not be built at all. When it stood complete and weatherproof, when his cabin sat safe inside it, when his firewood remained dry through the worst winter, then men like Jack Morrison could decide for themselves what it meant. Robert Fletcher returned 3 days later. He found Samuel digging foundation holes. The work was brutal. Each hole needed to be 3 feet deep to reach solid earth below the frost line. Samuel worked with a post hole digger and a shovel. His hands were covered in blisters. His back ached from the constant bending and lifting. He worked from first light until dark. Robert watched for several minutes before speaking. "You are actually doing this." Samuel paused and leaned on his shovel. "Yes." "How many holes?" 16 for the perimeter posts. "And you have dug how many? 7. Robert shook his head slowly. "The other men in town think you have lost your mind, but I am starting to wonder if you know something they do not." Samuel returned to digging. "I know that wet firewood killed my wife. I know that I need firewood to stay dry. And I know that the only way to guarantee that is to store it inside a structure. The rest follows from those facts." Robert sat on a nearby stump and watched Samuel work. The younger man's movements were economical. He placed each shovel of dirt in a neat pile beside the hole. He checked the depth regularly with a measuring stick. There was no wasted motion, no frustration, just steady, methodical progress. "My son could learn from watching you work," Robert said finally. "Bring him by if you want." Samuel did not look up from his digging. "I do not mind observers." Robert did bring his son. 10-year-old Ben Fletcher arrived the next morning quiet and watchful. He sat on the stump his father had used and watched Samuel finish the 8th foundation hole. When Samuel moved to start the 9th, Ben asked his first question. "Why so deep, Frostline?" Samuel answered. "Ground freezes in winter. If the posts sit in frozen ground, they will shift. 3 feet down stays below the freeze. Posts will be stable." Ben considered this. "How do you know where the frost line is?" "Ask men who have built here before. Learn from their experience." The boy nodded. He watched Samuel dig in silence for an hour. Then he went home. But he came back the next day, and the day after that. By late June, all 16 foundation holes were complete. Samuel began setting posts. These were pine logs he had cut himself from the wooded section of his property. Each post was 10 inches in diameter and 12 feet long. He had stripped the bark and shaped the bottoms to points so they would settle firmly into the holes. Setting the posts required techniques Samuel had learned by watching barn construction and asking questions others thought were idle curiosity. He positioned each post vertically in its hole, then filled the hole with rocks and tamped earth. The process was slow. A single post took most of a day to set properly. He checked each post obsessively for vertical alignment using a plumb line he made from a stone tied to string. If the post leaned even slightly, the entire structure would be crooked. He adjusted posts that showed minor deviation, digging them out and resetting them until he was satisfied. Robert Fletcher visited again in early July and found Samuel digging around a post for the 3rd time. "What are you doing?" The older man's voice carried genuine confusion. "This post is off by half a degree." Samuel did not stop working. "That deviation will compound when I add horizontal beams. The barn needs perfect foundation alignment, or everything built upon it will be compromised." Robert examined the other posts standing in precise formation. They rose like sentinels marking the barn's outline. He pulled out his own plumb line and checked 3 of them. All were perfectly vertical. "You are not just grieving," he said quietly. "You are executing a plan with engineering precision." Samuel looked up. "I need to understand every connection. If something fails, I need to know why and how to fix it." "Let me help you," Samuel shook his head. "I appreciate it, Robert, but this is work I need to do alone." "Then let me bring Ben. The boy can watch and learn. You are teaching him more about building in a week than I could teach him in a year." Samuel considered this, then nodded once. "Ben can come. He is a good student." The community's opinion shifted slightly. Samuel was still crazy for building a barn before a house, but he was apparently competent at the actual construction. People began stopping by to watch him work. Some offered advice. Samuel listened politely and continued using his own methods. By late July, all 16 posts stood perfectly vertical and perfectly spaced. The foundation was complete. Samuel allowed himself one evening to sit and look at what he had built. The posts rose against the summer sky like the bones of some enormous creature. They marked the outline of his vision, the barn that would protect the cabin that would keep him safe, the system that would ensure dry firewood forever. For the first time since Emma's death, Samuel felt something other than grief. He felt purpose. But that night alone in his small cabin, doubt crept in. He sat at the table Emma had used for her sewing and looked at his hands. They were calloused and scarred from weeks of hard labor. His body ached. The barn was only begun. The hardest work lay ahead. Horizontal beams to lift, a roof to frame, walls to build, and then the cabin inside, and then the firewood to split and stack. One man, one summer, an impossible task. What if everyone was right? What if grief had driven him to attempt something beyond his capacity? What if he failed? Samuel closed his eyes and saw Emma's face gray in the candlelight, heard her struggling to breathe, smelled the smoke from wet wood filling their cabin, felt the cold that no amount of burning furniture could chase away. No, he would not fail. Wet firewood had killed her. He would build a system that made that impossible, not for himself alone, for anyone who might face the same tragedy, for Ben Fletcher and children like him who would need to survive frontier winters when their parents were gone. Samuel opened his eyes. The doubt remained a small voice in the back of his mind, but it was drowned out by something stronger. Determination. The kind that came not from anger or pride, but from having seen clearly what mattered and what did not. The barn would be built. The cabin would stand inside it. The firewood would stay dry, and no one in Millbrook would ever again lose someone they loved to smoke from wet wood. That was worth any amount of doubt, worth any amount of mockery, worth any amount of pain. Samuel Winters blew out his candle and lay down to sleep. Tomorrow he would begin lifting the horizontal beams. The real test was just beginning. The horizontal beams arrived from the sawmill on a morning in mid-July. Samuel stood beside the wagon and looked at the massive timbers stacked in the bed. Each beam was 8 inches in diameter and roughly 300 pounds. Some of the longer pieces approached 400. The driver, a man named Thomas, who had hauled lumber for 20 years, shook his head as he helped Samuel unload them. "You planning to lift these alone?" Samuel positioned the first beam on the ground near his foundation posts. "Yes." Thomas spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Good luck with that. Takes 4 men to raise a beam this size. Sometimes 6. Samuel said nothing. He had already designed his solution. It waited in the barn he had not yet built, in the form of 6 iron pulleys purchased from Henry Brooks and 100 feet of good rope. When Thomas drove away, Samuel went to work. The pulley system took 2 days to rig. Samuel attached the pulleys to the vertical posts he had already set, creating a mechanical advantage that would multiply his strength by a factor of 8. He ran the rope through all 6 pulleys in sequence, then tied one end to a beam and the other to his horse. When he led the horse forward, the beam rose from the ground. Not quickly, not easily, but it rose. Ben Fletcher arrived that morning to find Samuel guiding a beam into position 6 feet above the ground. The boy watched in silence as Samuel secured the beam with temporary braces, then repositioned his pulleys for the next lift. When the beam finally settled into its notched supports on the vertical posts, Ben spoke. "How does it work physics?" Samuel wiped sweat from his face. "Each pulley changes the direction of force. Multiple pulleys working together multiply that force. I pull with the strength of 1 man. The system delivers the strength of 8. But you still have to control it." Samuel looked at the boy. "That is the difficult part." Yes, over the next 3 weeks, Samuel raised 11 more horizontal beams. Each one required the same careful choreography. Position the pulleys, attach the rope, lead the horse forward while guiding the beam with positioning ropes. Lift in increments of inches, not feet. Secure each gain before attempting the next. Never rush, never take shortcuts. One mistake would mean a 300-pound timber crashing down, possibly crushing him, certainly destroying weeks of work. The work was dangerous. Samuel understood this with perfect clarity. But danger could be managed through preparation and caution. He checked every rope each morning. He tested each pulley connection before committing weight to it. He watched for fraying, for wear, for anything that might indicate pending failure, which is why he noticed the cut. It was late July. The morning air was already thick with heat that promised a scorching afternoon. Samuel performed his routine inspection of the rope, running it through his hands, section by section, feeling for damage. 20 feet from the end, his fingers found something wrong. He stopped, examined the rope more closely. 3/4 of the rope's interior fibers had been severed cleanly. Only the outer strands remained intact. The cut was fresh. The exposed fibers showed no weathering. Someone had done this recently, within the last day or 2. Samuel stared at the rope in his hands. The implications were immediate and clear. This section of rope would appear sound until placed under load. Then the outer strands would fail. Whatever the rope was supporting would fall. If Samuel had been beneath a beam when it happened, he would be dead. Someone had tried to kill him. He stood perfectly still for a long moment. His mind worked through the possibilities. Who would benefit from his death? Who was threatened by his success? The answer came quickly. Jack Morrison, the master carpenter who had warned him against amateur construction, who had promised that Samuel's failure would vindicate professional builders. But Samuel had no proof. Accusing Morrison without evidence would accomplish nothing. It would make him look paranoid, delusional. It would give his critics ammunition to claim grief had indeed broken his mind. Instead, Samuel cut away the damaged section of rope and spliced in a new piece. Then he checked every inch of every rope in his system. He examined each pulley connection. He tested the strength of each knot. When he was satisfied, he began that day's work. But he was more careful now. He worked when others could see him. He never turned his back on open approaches to his construction site. And each morning he inspected everything before committing weight to any rope. Robert Fletcher arrived 2 days later and found Samuel testing a rope by hanging weights from it far exceeding what the rope would normally carry. "What are you doing, making certain my equipment is sound?" Robert watched the process. Something in Samuel's methodical testing suggested more than routine caution. Did something happen? Samuel showed him the cut section of rope he had saved. Someone did this, designed to fail under load. Robert's face went hard. Who Samuel coiled the damaged rope and set it aside. "Does not matter, I have no proof. And accusations without proof serve no purpose. You should report this to the sheriff and tell him what someone cut my rope could have been anyone. Could have been an accident." Samuel met Robert's eyes. "All I can do is be more careful. Check everything. Trust nothing." The older man nodded slowly. He understood frontier justice, understood that sometimes a man had to solve his own problems. "I will keep watch when I visit. And I will tell Ben to pay attention to who comes and goes." Samuel returned to his work. The incident with the rope had shaken him more than he cared to admit, not because of the danger. He had accepted danger as part of this project from the beginning, but because it meant someone wanted him to fail badly enough to risk his life. That level of hostility was something new, something he needed to account for in his planning. The horizontal beams were complete by the first week of August. 12 massive timbers connected the vertical posts, forming a rectangular frame 30 feet by 20 feet. Each joint was notched and pegged. Each connection was solid. The structure was taking shape. Now came the hardest part. The roof frame, the ridge beams. Samuel had known from the beginning that this would be the ultimate test. Ridge beams needed to span the barn's full 30-foot length. They needed to be strong enough to support the weight of the roof and any snow that accumulated on it. That meant timbers of substantial size. The beams Samuel had ordered were 12 inches in diameter. Each one weighed approximately 400 pounds. Standard barn construction required 6 men to lift a ridge beam into position. Samuel had only himself, his horse, and his pulley system. The pulleys could multiply his force, but the beam would be 30 feet long, swaying and unstable as it rose. Controlling it would require precision he had never attempted before. He spent 3 days preparing. He added more pulleys to his system. He positioned anchors at multiple points. He practiced with smaller beams, learning how they behaved as they rose, understanding the physics of long levers and center of gravity. When he was ready, he chose a morning when the wind was calm and began. Word had spread through Millbrook that Samuel Winters was attempting the impossible. Men came to watch. Some hoped he would succeed. Others wanted to see him fail. Jack Morrison arrived and stood at the back of the small crowd, his arms crossed, his face showing nothing. Samuel ignored them all. He positioned the first ridge beam on the ground, attached his primary lifting rope at the beam's center point, connected positioning ropes at quarter points along the length, tied the main line to his horse. Then he began. The process was agonizingly slow. Pull the main line to raise the center of the beam 6 inches. Secure it. Adjust the positioning ropes to keep the beam level. Pull another 6 inches. Secure again. The beam rose in tiny increments. After an hour, it was 2 feet off the ground. After 2 hours, 4 feet. Men in the crowd began to shift. Some left. This was taking too long. Nothing dramatic would happen, but others stayed. Robert Fletcher stood near the front with Ben beside him. The boy watched every movement Samuel made, his young mind absorbing the mechanics of what he was seeing. By noon, the beam had reached 10 feet. It was approaching at its final position, 12 feet above the ground. The angle of the lifting rope was becoming more acute. The mechanical advantage of the pulley system was decreasing. Samuel had anticipated this. He adjusted his rope routing, changing the angles, maintaining the multiplication of force he needed. The wind picked up, just a light breeze, but enough to make the 30-foot beam sway. Samuel stopped pulling it and waited. The beam swayed like a pendulum, its massive weight creating momentum that could tear the whole system apart if he tried to fight it. He watched, calculated, waited for the oscillation to decrease. One of the men in the crowd called out a warning. The beam was swaying too much. It would fall. Samuel should lower it and start over. Samuel did not respond. He kept his eyes on the beam. The sway was decreasing. When it had damped to acceptable levels, he signaled his horse forward. The beam rose another 6 inches. Then one of the positioning ropes slipped on its anchor point. The beam tilted 15 degrees to the left. The crowd gasped. Samuel was already moving. He grabbed the safety line he had rigged for exactly this contingency and pulled. The rope took the weight. The beam's tilt stopped. Samuel repositioned the slipped anchor, tested it, then continued the lift. By 2 in the afternoon, the ridge beam was in position. Samuel guided it the final inches into the notch supports he had cut in the horizontal beams. The fit was perfect. He drove wooden pegs through pre-drilled holes, locking the ridge beam permanently in place. The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then someone began to clap. Others joined. Even men who had come hoping to see Samuel fail found themselves applauding. What they had witnessed was impossible, yet they had seen it happen. Jack Morrison turned and walked away without a word. Robert Fletcher approached Samuel as the crowd dispersed. The younger man was coiling rope, his movements economical despite obvious exhaustion. "I watched something I cannot explain," Robert said quietly. "A man who weighs maybe 160 lifted a timber that 4 strong men would struggle to carry. You did it alone, using rope and pulleys and systematic thinking." Samuel did not look up from his work. Physics is not magic. It is understanding how forces interact. Some are calling it witchcraft. Now Samuel did look up. His eyes were hard. Let them call it what they want. "I have 5 more ridge beams to raise. Anyone who wants to understand can watch and learn. Anyone who wants to talk about witchcraft can stay home." The whispers started that night. Samuel Winters worked with unnatural precision. He understood forces and leverage in ways that seemed beyond normal human capacity. Some began to suggest dark sources for his knowledge. How else could a man accomplish alone what required crews? The accusations reached Reverend Daniel Clark within 2 days. The Reverend was a practical man who had served frontier communities for 20 years. He visited Samuel on a morning when the younger man was preparing to raise the second ridge beam. "I have heard troubling talk," the Reverend said after greeting Samuel. "Some say you have help from powers that are not divine." Samuel set down the rope he was checking. "What do you believe, Reverend?" "I believe God gave men minds to solve problems. I believe intelligence is a gift, not a curse. But I also believe you need to address these rumors directly. Frontier communities can turn on a man accused of witchcraft." Samuel looked at the barn frame rising around them. The vertical posts and horizontal beams formed a skeleton of massive timbers. Every joint was visible. Every connection could be examined. "Tell anyone who has questions to come see me," Samuel said. "I will explain exactly how the pulleys work, how the ropes multiply force. The mathematics are simple. Any man who wants to understand can understand." Reverend Clark nodded. "I will deliver that message, and I will speak to this in my next sermon. Intelligence is not supernatural, it is divine gift." True to his word, the Reverend used his Sunday sermon to defend Samuel. He spoke of the mind as God's greatest gift to mankind, of problem-solving as sacred work, of innovation as holy calling. The sermon did not silence all the whispers, but it silenced enough. The talk of witchcraft faded to background noise. Samuel raised the remaining 5 ridge beams over the next 3 weeks. Each lift went more smoothly than the last. He refined his technique, learned the rhythm of the work. By late August, the roof frame was complete. 6 ridge beams spanned the barn's length. Smaller rafters connected the ridges to the horizontal beams. The skeleton of a roof stood against the summer sky. Visitors who saw the completed frame were forced to admit that Samuel Winters had built something impressive. The structure was square. The joints were tight. The timbers were massive and solid. He had done professional quality work, alone, in less than 4 months. September brought the roof covering. Samuel installed rough sawn boards across the rafters and overlapping courses that would shed water. The work went faster than the framing. By October 20th, the barn had a weatherproof roof. When the first autumn rain came, Samuel stood inside and watched water drum on the boards above him. The ground beneath his feet stayed dry. He had created weather protection large enough to hold everything he had planned. Neighbors asked when he would start his actual house. Winter was perhaps 6 weeks away. He could not survive the cold living in an open barn frame. Samuel replied that he would begin the cabin soon. First, he needed to close the barn sides to complete the weather protection. He installed vertical board siding on 3 sides of the barn during November. The 4th side facing south he left partially open. The opening was wide enough to drive a wagon through. He could close it later with large doors if needed. For now, the opening served his purposes. It provided access and light. The barn was complete. Samuel moved his few possessions inside in late November and set up a temporary living space in one corner. Then he laid out the cabin's foundation using stakes and string. The rectangle measured 16 feet wide and 14 feet deep. The cabin would sit near the center of the barn. 7 feet of space would remain between the cabin walls and barn walls on all sides. That space would hold his firewood. People who visited and saw the staked outline finally understood what Samuel was building. He was actually constructing a house inside the barn. The concept was so strange that visitors asked multiple questions to ensure they understood correctly. Yes, a complete cabin with walls, roof, windows, and door. Yes, inside the barn. Yes, he would live in the cabin while the barn surrounded it. Robert Fletcher asked the question others were thinking. Why not simply build the cabin by itself and be done? Samuel's answer was simple. A cabin surrounded by barn walls would never face direct weather. The barn would protect it from rain, snow, and wind. The space between would store 12 cords of firewood with absolute protection from moisture. He would access dry fuel regardless of conditions outside. My wife died because wet firewood filled our cabin with smoke. I will never face that situation again. Robert considered the logic and found it sound, even if unconventional. Samuel began cabin construction on December 1st. He started with a foundation of flat stones arranged in a level rectangle. The stones would keep the cabin's base logs off the ground, preventing rot. He gathered them from the creek bed, selecting flat pieces that would stack evenly. The work took a week. On December 9th, he began laying cabin logs. They were pine 10 to 12 inches in diameter, stripped of bark, and shaped to consistent roundness. Samuel had prepared them during the summer. Now he lifted them onto a stone foundation and began notching corners using the saddle notch technique. Each notch required careful work with hatchet, chisel, and saw. The cabin walls rose one log at a time. Samuel worked alone, lifting each log using a small ramp and lever system. The work was slow but steady. By late December, the walls had risen to waist height. By year's end, they stood 5 feet tall. He needed approximately 15 more courses to reach the height where he would begin roof construction. The mockery from town had quieted. Samuel's barn stood solid through early winter storms. His cabin construction showed the same competence he had demonstrated in barn building. People still thought the entire project was excessive and strange, but they could no longer claim he did not know what he was doing. The cabin walls reached full height on January 28, 1843. Now came the roof. Samuel had designed something more complex than standard cabin construction required. He planned a double-gable design, 2 overlapping roof sections at different heights. The design would distribute snow load and create better interior air circulation. Local carpenters visited while he was building the roof frames. They examined his design and admitted it was structurally sound, though more complicated than necessary. One carpenter warned about the valley where the 2 roof sections would meet. That valley would collect water. It could leak if not sealed properly. Samuel understood. He had planned for it. When he installed the roof boards, he cut careful angles where the 2 sections met. Then he applied thick pine tar along the valley seam. Over the tar, he nailed additional boards, creating a double seal. The carpenters admitted the valley looked adequately protected. On March 3rd, Samuel purchased 4 glass windows from Henry Brooks. Each window consisted of 4 panes in a wooden frame. The cost was significant. Most frontier cabins had 1 window at most. Samuel installed all 4 across the cabin's front wall. Light flooded the interior. He could see clearly throughout the space during daylight hours. By late March, the cabin interior was complete. Samuel built a stone fireplace in one corner, with a chimney that extended through both cabin roof sections and exited above the barn roof. He installed a wooden floor, built a sleeping platform, shelves, a table. Everything was finished to the same exacting standards as the barn itself. On April 1st, Samuel began splitting firewood. He had stockpiled logs throughout the winter. Now he converted them to split pieces using a maul and wedges. The work was exhausting but straightforward. He split wood from dawn until mid-afternoon each day. The pieces piled up in neat stacks around the cabin's exterior, arranged by wood type for different burning purposes. By June, the firewood storage was half complete. 6 cords of split wood surrounded the cabin. By late August, he had reached his goal. 12 cords of perfectly seasoned wood and filled the space between cabin and barn walls. The system was complete. September 18th brought the first frost. Samuel woke to ice crystals on grass visible through the barn's open entrance. Everything was ready. The barn was solid, the cabin was tight, the firewood was dry and accessible. He had built exactly what he set out to build. Robert Fletcher visited on September 22nd with news. Old-timers were predicting an early and harsh winter. The signs all pointed to heavy snow arriving before November. Robert suggested Samuel should consider moving into town for the winter. The barn cabin system was untested. If something failed during severe weather, he would be isolated and vulnerable. Samuel thanked him for the concern and declined. His system would work. He had built everything to withstand the worst conditions. But as Robert rode away, Samuel stood in his barn and looked at what he had created. 18 months of work, every timber cut and shaped by his own hands, every joint fitted and pegged, every calculation proven through construction. The barn surrounded him like a cathedral. The cabin inside was his sanctuary. The firewood was his guarantee against the cold that had killed Emma. The system was complete. Now winter would test it. And winter, the old-timer said, was coming early. The delegation arrived on October 12th. 3 men rode up to Samuel's property in the early afternoon. Robert Fletcher, Henry Brooks, and Reverend Daniel Clark. They dismounted and found Samuel on the barn roof repairing a section of siding that had worked loose during a windstorm. Samuel climbed down and faced the 3 men. He knew why they had come. The Reverend spoke first. "Samuel, the community cares about your well-being. Living alone in an untested structure through what promises to be a severe winter is unwise. We have arranged space with the Brooks family. You would be welcome there until spring." Samuel wiped his hands on his trousers. He looked at each man in turn. "I appreciate your concern, but my decision is final. I am staying in my home." Henry Brooks stepped forward. "You are being unreasonably stubborn. This is pride talking, not sense." Samuel met his eyes. "No, this is preparation talking. I have built everything to withstand the worst conditions. The barn is weatherproof. The cabin is sound. My firewood is dry and plentiful. I have food stored. Water is accessible. I am not being stubborn. I am being ready." "What if something breaks?" Robert asked. "You are more than a mile from the nearest neighbor. A broken bone and illness, any emergency could be fatal." Samuel had considered all of this. "If I need help, I will hang a white cloth from the barn entrance. Check on me periodically if you want. But I will not abandon what I have built because others doubt it." The men left frustrated. Samuel watched them ride away, then returned to his repairs. He understood their concern, but concern did not change the facts. He had built this system for a reason. To prove it worked, he needed to live in it, to trust it through the hardest test winter could offer. On October 5th, Samuel moved his remaining possessions into the cabin. Everything he owned fit into the 16 by 14-foot space. He arranged it with the same precision he had applied to construction. Tools had designated places. Food supplies were organized by type. Clothing hung on pegs he had installed along one wall. The cabin felt solid. The stone fireplace drew perfectly. The wooden floor was level and smooth. The 4 windows provided excellent light during the day. At night, the space stayed warm with a modest fire. The barn surrounding the cabin blocked drafts completely. Samuel spent the first week of October testing his systems. He cooked meals and monitored how the fireplace performed. He tracked how quickly the cabin warmed and how long it retained heat. He practiced accessing his firewood walking from the cabin door to the nearest woodpile, selecting fuel and returning. The entire process took less than a minute. He never needed to step outside the barn. The first snow fell on October 24th. Light flakes accumulated to an inch before melting. Samuel watched from inside his cabin. The barn roof shed the snow efficiently. None entered the barn interior. His firewood stacks remained completely dry. He lit a fire in the fireplace and enjoyed the warmth while snow fell outside. More snow came on October 29th. 4 inches accumulated. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. Winter had arrived a month early, exactly as the old-timers had predicted. The great storm began on November 9th. Snow started falling at dawn and continued for 36 hours. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees. Wind drove the snow sideways, creating drifts that buried fence posts and transformed the landscape into an undifferentiated white expanse. Samuel watched the storm from his cabin windows. Snow piled against the barn's exterior walls, but did not enter through the open southern entrance. The barn's orientation and overhang kept the interior protected. A thin layer of snow blew onto the barn floor near the entrance, but melted quickly from the ambient warmth trapped inside the structure. The cabin stayed warm throughout the storm. Samuel burned oak in his fireplace, maintaining steady heat. The barn surrounding his cabin acted as insulation. Cold air outside had to penetrate the barn before reaching the cabin walls. The temperature inside the barn remained significantly warmer than outside. The cabin interior stayed comfortable with moderate fuel consumption. When the storm ended, Samuel ventured outside the barn to assess conditions. Snow reached above his knees. The landscape was buried under 2 feet of accumulation, with drifts reaching 4 and 5 feet in places where wind had gathered it. He could see smoke rising from distant cabins where neighbors struggled to stay warm. He returned to his barn and walked to his firewood stores. Every piece was bone dry. Not a single snowflake had touched his fuel supply. The system had performed exactly as he had engineered it to perform. Robert Fletcher struggled through deep snow to check on Samuel on November 11th. He found the younger man outside the barn, shoveling a path to his well. Samuel had already cleared most of the area and was working methodically. "How did you fare in the storm?" Robert asked. "Fine. Warm cabin, dry wood, plenty of supplies." Robert described his own experience. His woodpile covered with canvas had still gotten wet. Snow had blown under the canvas edges and soaked the outer layers of his stack. He was burning damp wood that created more smoke than heat. He needed to bring wood inside his cabin to dry before it would burn properly. The process was slow and inconvenient. Samuel invited him into the barn. Robert stepped inside and stopped. The space was warmer than he had expected. Protected from wind and snow, the barn held heat like a blanket. Samuel led him to the firewood storage. 12 cords of split wood stacked in organized rows between the cabin and barn walls. Robert picked up a piece. It was completely dry, slightly warm from the ambient temperature inside the barn. He examined the storage arrangement. The barn roof kept all precipitation away. The barn walls blocked wind-driven snow. The elevation off the ground prevented moisture from wicking up from below. "This is brilliant," Robert said quietly. "Simple engineering, perfect execution." Samuel selected several pieces of oak. "It is what I needed to build." Robert hesitated, then spoke. "Can I purchase some dry wood? My family is struggling. The children need warmth." Samuel showed him the remaining stores. He had burned approximately 3 cords since November. 9 cords remained, more than enough for the rest of winter. "Take 2 cords, Robert. No charge." Robert stared at him. "I must pay, or work it off." "No, you need dry wood for your family. I have surplus. I remember what inadequate firewood means. I will not charge neighbors for something that might save lives." Robert extended his hand. Samuel shook it. The grip was firm. The gesture spoke what words could not. Respect between men. Gratitude that ran deeper than payment. Robert spent the next day hauling wood from Samuel's barn to his cabin. His children would stay warm. Word of Samuel's gift spread through Millbrook within days. Other families facing fuel shortages came asking if they could purchase wood. The Henderson family's woodshed had collapsed under snow weight. The Yates family's breadwinner had been injured and could not gather wood. Samuel gave each family 1 cord. He was down to 5 cords personally, still enough for himself through the hardest winter. The community's perception transformed. Samuel Winters was not just a smart engineer. He was a good man who helped neighbors in need. He had built his system not for pride, but because he understood what inadequate shelter and wet firewood could cost. Reverend Clark spoke of Samuel in his January 28th sermon, though the younger man was not present to hear it. The Reverend spoke of wisdom and thorough preparation and virtue in sharing abundance. The true measure of a man, he said, was not what he built, but what he gave. January brought the coldest temperatures in memory, below zero for days at a time. Smoke from cabin chimneys hung in still air as families burned wood, constantly trying to maintain livable temperatures. Fuel consumption accelerated across the region. Families who had thought their wood supplies adequate began worrying about running short before spring. Robert Fletcher's family faced crisis on January 20th. They were burning through wood faster than anticipated. His wife was pregnant. His 2 children needed warmth. The family could not reduce their fire without risking everyone's health. Robert took Ben and Clara into the forest to gather more wood. The work was brutal. Snow was waist deep. They had to dig to find fallen branches and small trees. Everything was frozen solid and covered in ice. After 4 hours of hard labor, they had gathered perhaps one-tenth of a cord. Much of it was poor quality, wet or frozen, that would burn badly. On January 22nd, Robert returned to Samuel's property. He found the younger man outside the barn enjoying winter sun despite the cold. Samuel was well-dressed and appeared comfortable. Robert explained his situation. His family was burning through fuel faster than expected. Could he take more wood? Samuel brought him into the barn and showed him the remaining 5 cords. Take another cord. Dunam. Your children need it. Robert tried again to pay. Again, Samuel refused. I built surplus for a reason. This is the reason. 2 other families came that week with similar needs. Samuel gave each one cord of wood. He was down to 2 cords for himself, enough to last through February and March if he was careful. But he had given away more than half his carefully prepared supply. People talked about it in town, about the widower who had been mocked for his crazy barn plan, who now was helping families survive when their conventional preparations had failed. The barn cabin system that everyone had ridiculed was proving superior to traditional frontier housing in every measurable way. The delegation returned on February 4th. This time 4 men came: Robert Fletcher, Henry Brooks, and 2 others who were planning construction projects. They came with serious intent. They wanted to understand Samuel's methods. Several families were already planning to build similar structures before next winter. Samuel gave them a comprehensive tour. He walked them through the entire system, explaining each element. The barn structure created weatherproof space. The cabin inside provided living quarters, with the barn acting as insulation and protection. The firewood stored between the 2 structures stayed dry, regardless of weather outside, while remaining easily accessible. Henry asked detailed questions about post spacing, beam sizing, roof construction. Samuel answered everything precisely. He had kept mental notes of every dimension and technique. He shared information freely, holding nothing back. If others wanted to build similar structures, he would help them avoid mistakes. One man asked about cost. Samuel estimated the barn cabin system cost approximately 40% more than building a standard cabin and separate woodshed. But the benefits justified the cost: superior weather protection, better insulation, guaranteed dry firewood, covered workspace. Another asked about construction time. Samuel had worked alone for 14 months, but much of that time had gone to learning techniques. With experience and a crew, a barn cabin could be completed in 4 to 5 months. Families could build during summer and be ready for winter. Robert asked the question others were thinking: why did you build this when no one else had? The principles are not complicated once seen. Weather protection for firewood is obvious now. Why had frontier settlers not developed this approach years ago? Samuel thought carefully before answering. Most men build the minimum necessary to survive. They accept wet firewood as unavoidable. They do not question traditional methods. I questioned everything after losing Emma. That questioning led to different answers. He paused, then continued. Innovation comes from refusing to accept that current methods are the only methods. A man should build what he needs, not what tradition dictates. 3 families committed immediately to building barn cabins before next winter. The Fletchers, Hendersons, and Yates would pool labor and help each other. They planned to start in April. Henry said he would stock additional barn building supplies at his store. He anticipated demand. Do you regret the mockery? Robert asked. The doubt, the isolation. Samuel shook his head. No, others' opinions during construction were irrelevant. What mattered was building something that worked. The barn cabin works. Vindication does not matter. Function matters. A man proves himself through results, not words. Spring came in March. Snow melted slowly, revealing winter's toll on standard frontier structures. Several cabins had developed roof leaks from ice dams. Woodsheds had collapsed under snow weight. Families tallied the costs of a harsh winter and calculated how much fuel they had burned. The 3 committed families began planning in earnest. They met regularly to discuss construction strategies. They visited Samuel's property multiple times, studying the barn structure, asking detailed questions. Samuel helped them refine their plans. He suggested modifications based on what he had learned. Place the barn entrance facing south for maximum light and warmth. Build the cabin slightly off-center to allow more firewood storage on one side. Include proper drainage around the foundation. Robert Fletcher began construction on April 10th. His design followed Samuel's general concept but adapted to his larger family's needs. His barn would be 35 feet by 25 feet. His cabin would be slightly larger to accommodate his wife and children. He recruited help from the Henderson and Yates families, trading labor across all three projects. The construction proceeded faster than Samuel's solo effort. With experienced hands and shared knowledge, the barn frames rose quickly. By May, all three barns had roofs. By June, the cabins inside were taking shape. The families planned to have everything complete by September. Two additional families started their own barn cabin projects in midsummer. Samuel consulted on each, sharing freely, never charging for advice. By July, Henry Brooks told Samuel that the barn cabin design was becoming the preferred construction method for new settlements in the region. People were calling it the Winters method. "I do not care what they call it," Samuel said. "I care about families staying warm and safe." Summer brought visitors from distant settlements. People who had heard about the barn cabin system traveled to see examples. Samuel gave tours and answered questions. He never charged for information, never claimed ownership of the concept. He wanted the idea to spread as widely as possible. By autumn of 1844, 7 barn cabin structures existed in the region. 5 more were under construction. The design was becoming standard rather than experimental. Samuel's innovation had achieved widespread adoption in less than 2 years. Jack Morrison had left Millbrook that spring, heading west to territories where his reputation remained untarnished. Some said he still claimed Samuel's success was luck, not skill. But no one who saw the barn cabins believed him. The winter of 1844-45 was mild compared to the previous year. But the barn cabin structures proved their value regardless of severity. Families living in the new designs reported consistent comfort, dry firewood, and reduced fuel consumption. The system worked exactly as Samuel had demonstrated. By spring of 1845, the concept had spread beyond Millbrook. Travelers carried descriptions to other frontier settlements. A trapper heading to Montana Territory mentioned seeing a barnhouse design that solved firewood storage problems. A merchant traveling east described the innovation to settlers preparing to move west. Robert Fletcher told Samuel in 1846 that at least 30 barn cabins existed across the northern territories. The number would grow as more families settled the frontier. Samuel's response to his wife's death had created architectural change across thousands of square miles. "You should feel proud," Robert said. "I feel relieved that fewer men will face what I faced." Samuel lived quietly through these years. He maintained his barn cabin, managed his property, and helped neighbors when asked. He never promoted himself or sought recognition. When visitors came to see his original structure, he answered questions and shared information freely. He wanted people to build well, not to credit him. In 1863, Samuel Winters prepared to leave. He was 46 years old. His sister's family in Ohio had written asking him to come live with them. He was ready for a quieter life. The barn cabin had served him for 20 years. The structure remained sound. He sold the property to a young couple starting their own homestead. He showed them the barn cabin system, explained maintenance requirements, walked them through the firewood storage arrangement. "This structure will last decades if you care for it properly," he told them. On his final day, Samuel stood in the barn one last time. He looked at the cabin he had built inside, the massive timbers overhead, the carefully stacked firewood between. 20 years had passed since Emma's death. 20 years since wet firewood and smoke had taken her from him. He had kept his promise. Wet firewood had never killed anyone in this place. The system he built had worked, had spread, had saved lives he would never know about in places he would never see. Samuel walked outside and mounted his horse. He looked back once at the barn rising against the sky. Then he turned east and rode toward Ohio. Behind him, smoke rose from dozens of barn cabins scattered across the valley. Families staying warm, children safe from the cold. His legacy was not carved in stone or written in books. It was built into structures that sheltered families through frontier winters. Innovation born from tragedy. Engineering driven by love. A solution so simple that, once seen, it seemed obvious. But it had taken one man's grief and determination to see it first. The impossible had become routine, and that Samuel Winters thought as he rode away was legacy enough for any man.